How does the agricultural cycle affect Shinto-related ritual celebrations?
Many festivities are still tied to various agricultural occasions. Spring and autumn festivals correspond with planting and harvesting. A large cluster of so-called spring festivals. Harumatsuri covers events that run generally from January to May, though some areas stretch the season into July. In late March or April, people celebrate Cherry Blossom Festival, one of nature's sublime but fleeting glories. On May 5th, 5th of the 5th in some places, other days elsewhere, many people observe a special rice planting day. Two of Kyoto's larger shrines, Kamigamo and Shimogamo in the north of the city, celebrate a prayer for good harvest called Hollyhock Festival, Aoi Matsuri, complete with elaborate processions and reenactments of ancient imperial events. With countless regional variations, the planting, or transplanting, rites occur generally during May, June, and July, stretching well into the summer season. This seasonal overlap is a result of using more than one system for converting special occasions from the lunar to the solar calendar. Some shrines host enormous gatherings centered around processions and contests of various kinds. Autumn festivals, Akimatsuri, include a similar grouping of celebrations that begin even before the summer festival season has ended and extend into October. At the beginning of each imperial era, the new emperor performs an autumn celebration called the Great Feast of New Food, Daijasai, offering rice to the sun goddess and imperial forebears. Whether in the imperial palace or at local shrines, these are all occasions for gratitude to the kami for bountiful harvest. Between planting and harvest are a host of generally smaller summer festivals. Natsumatsuri, during which people pray for a healthy crop. Some shrines, however, still host major celebrations during July, August, and September. Many of these are occasions for teams of younger men and boys especially to engage in spirited competition, vying to get their mikoshi along the procession route faster and arrive at the shrine first. Winter festivals. Fuyu no Matsuri, revolve largely around preparations for the end of the year and New Year's celebrations, Shogesu. Calculated on the solar calendar, the winter solstice heralds the new year. So many people begin them with ceremonial cleaning and wrap up the old year by laying old sewing needles to rest at a local shrine. Honor for all things that contribute to human civilization, not for human beings alone that have come to the end of their lives, is essential. 7 days during a period called the Great Cold, Daikon, generally between January 6th and 21st, retain some of their ancient associations. People gather at shrines to enjoy the return of the sun in lengthening days that portend spring, and to pray for good fortune in general.
Are there any Confucian or CIT holy sites or cities?
Confucian tradition spotlights a number of places associated with the lives of Confucius and other major sages and scholars. Only a year after Confucius' death, the Duke of Lu dedicated a temple to him in Khufu, 478 BCE. Within a few years, his tomb and temple in Khufu had become widely known holy places. As early as 195 BCE, an imperial sacrifice at the tomb further broadened Khufu's fame as a sacred site. Confucian tradition did not elevate any one city to prominence as a center of authoritative teaching. But certain cities were home to the great Confucian universities. The most important cities were always associated with the seat of imperial government. And that changed often through Chinese history, even during the tenure of a single dynasty. Beijing has been perhaps the most important Confucian city. It was the capital uninterruptedly for nearly 500 years. And Confucianism was highly favored and influential through virtually that whole period.
Are there any Daoist holy places?
Mountains are the most prominent of Daoism's sacred sites. But they were sacred to the Chinese long before Daoism. 4 mountains marked the cardinal directions of ancient Chinese symbolic geography. And a 5th was eventually added at the center. Perhaps in connection with the notion of 5 elements: earth, air, water, fire, and metal. Each mountain has its chief deity who discharges his own distinctive duties. A number of individual mountains in addition to the main 5 also possess special properties and are connected with particular deities or Daoist sects and schools. Mount Heming, Sichuan Province, is famed as the place where Zhang Daoling inaugurated religious Daoism. Daoists share Mount Zhongnan, Shenzi Province, with Buddhists as a sacred site. The Celestial Masters School established its center on Mount Longhu, Jiangxi Province. Hundreds of Daoist and Buddhist temples have stood on dozens of such sacred peaks. 2 related features of Daoist sacred geography are the system of 10 great and 36 lesser grotto heavens and 7 Taituo blessed spots, some of which are located on famed mountains. These sites, mostly caves, are so designated because they are foci of sacred energy. They are often associated with religious figures believed to have found meditative solitude there and are likened to heavenly dwellings.
What were the earliest Confucian sacred texts?
A set of works called the 5 Classics, Wuzheng, became a formal collection sometime during the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 20 CE. The Yijing, or Classic of Change, is a manual of divination dating from the early Zhou dynasty. c. 1030 to 256 BCE. Based on the 64 hexagrams formed by combinations of the 8 trigrams. Described in the chapter on Daoism, the Yijing assists practitioners in the interpretation of fundamental life choices. although it was originally designed as a descriptive device. Popular usage over the centuries has bestowed on the book powers of prognostication. The classic of history, Shujing, assembles historical documents from as early as 600 BCE to as late as 200 CE. An anthology of over 300 poems, some from as early as 800 to 600 BCE. Is called the classic of poetry, Shijing. Ancient tradition that Confucius himself had compiled the material from. A larger collection of over 3,000 pieces is probably inaccurate. But it does appear that Confucius and his disciples used the poems as sources of ethical example. Completed around 100 CE of material from much earlier times, the classic of rites. Religie preserves ceremonial records that offer essential insights into ritual life. It eventually became one of 3 texts on rites known collectively. With the ceremonial and ritual or Yili and the officials of the Zhou dynasty or Zhou as the Li Qing. Finally, the Annals of Spring and Autumn, Chun Qiu. Chronicles events in Confucius' home province of Lu from 722 to 481 BCE, called the period of spring and autumn. And the tradition that Confucius edited the text seems to be accurate. Confucius may also have authored part of an extensive commentary on the Yijing. A now lost classic of music, Yujing, would have constituted the 6th classic. Confucius probably did not edit the last 4 classics as ancient tradition claims. Though he certainly knew the material intimately.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Daoist worship and prayer?
Specific lists of objects vary somewhat among the different schools and sects. Here are the most important ritual devices of the Celestial Masters school. First and foremost are the ubiquitous talismans that consist of a written magical formula or mantras symbolizing a contract between the deities and human beings engaging in a ritual exchange. Only a qualified ritual specialist may execute a talisman, which usually includes a specially drawn Chinese character as well as other visual symbols appropriate to a particular spiritual purpose. Possessors of talismans generally think of them as guarantees of divine aid. People wear them or hang them in home or office to attract positive energies. The precious sword of the 7 stars, symbolizing the Big Dipper, appears often in blessings and exorcisms, whether for individuals or as part of cosmic renewal observances. As a symbolic purification to the cardinal directions. Ritualists sip from a copper bowl and blow a spray through closed lips. Special stone seals of various kinds allow the specialist to make official documents such as talismans. Priests hold a stiff tablet, as if reading from a book. In exorcism rituals, black hats use the sword along with handbells, while red turbans use a horn and a whip.
What are some of the main varieties of Buddhist religious officials or specialists?
each of the many distinct denominations and their constituent religious institutions has its characteristic division of labor. One way to keep it all straight is to think in terms of the four functional categories of administration: instruction, pastoral care, and spiritual example. There is naturally some overlapping, but the four categories offer an idea of the kinds of responsibilities and duties Buddhists consider most important. Denominations, monastic institutions, and local temples all have administrative structures and offices. Buddhists use terms roughly equivalent to bishop, abbot, and chief priest or pastor in this regard. Teachers or preceptors are charged with instructing. Both monastic and lay Buddhists, especially in the meditative disciplines. At the local level, priests and monks who serve the public in monastery, temples and chapels fulfill the pastoral care function, offering such services as counseling and visiting the sick, as well as leadership in worship. A final category that is in many ways distinctively Buddhist, and yet difficult to define, is that of spiritual exemplar. Here are located all the various ranks of revered patriarchs, founders, incarnations of previous holy persons, and individuals celebrated for teaching by example. Tibetan Buddhists, for example, call such people by various titles including Lama, Rinpoche, and Tulku.
Have there been important Christian mystics?
Since late antiquity, many Christian men and women have been known for their profound experiential insight into the divine mystery. Some of these mystics have been theologians, authors of important treatises on various aspects of the Christian faith. But more importantly, theirs is a legacy of wonder and even bewilderment at the ways God relates to attentive human beings. Some of the best-known Christian women have been mystics. Accounts of Christian mysticism typically begin with the 6th century Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite, whose Greek writings laid the foundations of mystical thinking, and provided a lexicon that subsequent authors would use for many centuries. Most of the great mystics lived during the High and Late Middle Ages, though a number lived during Renaissance and early modern times as well. Hugh, c. 1096–1141, and Richard d. 1173, of Saint Victor, leaders of the Victorine school of Paris, believed that creation manifested the mind of God and was thus the beginning of a path to contemplation. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098–1179, was a visionary Benedictine nun whose extensive writings and musical compositions have enjoyed remarkable popularity of late, thanks to fine new translations and CD recordings. Mechtild of Magdeburg, c. 1210–80, a member of a lay sisterhood called the Beguines, recorded her revelatory visions of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, as did her younger contemporary Gertrude, 1256–1302. Meister Eckhart, c. 1260–1327. was a German Dominican whose teaching on divine human intimacy evoked accusations of pantheism and heresy. His spiritual descendants Henry Suso, c. 1295–1366, and Johann Tauler, c. 1300–61, sought to clarify Eckhart by connecting him to the officially acceptable thought of Thomas Aquinas, d. 1274. Other famous mystics, far too numerous to mention individually even briefly, included Catherine of Siena, c. 1340–80, Jan van Ruysbroek, 1293–1381, Juliana of Norwich, c. 1342–1413, Ignatius Loyola, 1491–1556, Teresa of Avila, 1515–82, and John of the Cross, 1542–91.
What are the Four Noble Truths?
Enlightenment means grasping the fundamental realities. Summed up in Buddhism's Four Noble Truths, life is difficult. All hardship and suffering comes from inappropriate attachment or grasping. To avoid suffering, avoid inappropriate craving. To stop inappropriate craving, follow the Eightfold Noble Path.
Do people ever decide they want to depart from Daoism or CCT?
Membership in Daoism and CCT has rarely, if ever, been a matter of exclusive allegiance. Members of some major religious traditions, such as Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and, to a lesser degree, Hinduism, typically regard belonging as a kind of all-or-nothing affair. Either you're in, or you're out. Disagree with major tenets of the tradition, or neglect consistently and willfully to fulfill the minimum ritual and ethical requirements of the faith community, and your membership is in question or has lapsed altogether. Religiously involved Chinese generally do not think about membership in those terms. Belonging is deeply rooted in national and local culture, integral to the very fabric of society. Individuals who drift away from regular religious practice have not necessarily left, so long as they have not entirely cut themselves off from family and social connections. Other family members might express regret that sons or daughters no longer find the traditional ways helpful and have chosen to delete that part of their heritage from their self-identities. And many today sense the gradual diminishment of traditional values and practices precisely because of this sort of attrition. But Chinese, whether Daoist or CCT, generally do not think in terms of leaving the faith, unless they do so with the intention of converting to a missionary faith, such as Christianity. In those cases, people do talk of leaving behind unacceptable beliefs and practices.
Have prophets played a role in Confucian tradition?
Confucian tradition developed in ways very different from the so-called prophetic or Abrahamic traditions. Confucius and his disciples never claimed to have received a revelation from above. They did not consider themselves privy to divine secrets. Their job was to call people back to social responsibility, however. And in that respect they share an important characteristic with the classical prophet figures of other traditions. Confucius also felt himself called to speak of justice to those in power. Much as Israel's prophets and Islam's prophet Muhammad challenged the rulers of their day. But on the whole, Confucian tradition and its literati were much too closely identified with imperial rule to function as effective critics of the system. Some scholars distinguish between prophets as seers, and people of action, like Confucius, as doers. One such Confucian seer came at a time when Confucianism was waning as the theory behind CIT. Liao Ping, 1852–1932 CE, considered himself and Confucius prophetic figures. As it turned out, he was a minor player. Known perhaps best of all for his lament over the demise of imperial Confucianism. Think of him as the exception that proves the rule.
Are there any organizations or institutions that have their own distinctive structures of leadership within Shinto?
An important organization in Shinto is the Shrine Guild, Miyazie. Composed of village elders who share responsibility for their local clan or parish shrine. Each man agrees to oversee shrine affairs for a full year. Other organizations called kosha have occasionally sought to raise funds to send members on pilgrimage or to galvanize public support for a particular project such as shrine renovation. Some of those groups eventually grew into the various Shinto sects of modern times. Various groups known as Sodeikai, Ujikokai, and Ujiko Sodei, loose synonyms for associations of parishioners/worshippers, have sprung up all over Japan for the purpose of gathering donations and sponsoring festivals. Unlike some other traditions, Shinto is not famous for developing major internal organizations such as religious or monastic orders that may connect to the fact that the Shinto priesthood itself is historically associated with heredity and clan and has never been an ordained clergy as such. There are, however, exceptions, such as the monastic order that grew out of a sectarian lineage called Yutetsu Shinto.
What is a patron saint?
Patron saints function in some Christian communities as a human counterpart to guardian angels. There are two general types of patron saint. It was once common for some Christians to name their children after holy men and women, thus attaching the youngsters to patrons who would look after their spiritual needs. More often, Saints are identified with groups of people, such as members of a profession. Carpenters, musicians, mariners, or with special circumstances, such as affliction with a particular illness or a challenge. People pray to Saint Jude, patron of lost causes, for relief from apparently incurable diseases. Some beseech Saint Anthony for help in finding what has been lost.
Where do Buddhists go to get the various signs and symbols they use often?
Wherever Buddhism has been an important part of a culture, Buddhists can easily find stores that specialize in religious goods and devotional objects. Walk down any number of streets in cities like Kyoto, Japan, or Keelung, Taiwan, for example, and you may find yourself passing such a shop. Japanese Buddhist goods stores tend to carry exclusively Buddhist items. Most prominently, on display are images of the Buddha, usually of Amida, and of various bodhisattvas. To install the images at home or the office, one can buy altars and shrines built like miniature temples, with several shelves inside and doors that can be closed. In Taiwan, where Buddhism so often blends together with Taoist and popular folk traditions, items of interest to Buddhist devotees frequently appear, interspersed with images of the Eight Immortals and other Chinese religious figures. Religious goods stores offer devotional items in several sizes and price ranges. Small pieces suitable for homes of modest income or full-size images designed for temples with sizable congregations.
What is meant by the phrase resurrection of the body?
Christians believe that all who have died will rise again. When Jesus Christ comes in glory at the end of the world, humanity's rising will be patterned on the resurrection of Jesus. He who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. 2 Corinthians 4:14. Christians believe that human beings are called not to be simply souls or spirits, but to be fully alive, in body and in soul. Thus, the entire human person, body and soul, is destined to share eternal life with God in heaven.
What is the difference between a custom and a ritual?
Custom includes a whole range of activities that people in a particular time and cultural setting become so used to doing that they rarely examine their reasons for acting that way. Custom is the way we've always done things. It includes everything from social expectations and etiquette to the specific kinds of food people serve for special occasions. Common law is a type of customary social norm. Its practices have been in use so long that they have assumed legal status and authority. Custom operates at various levels, from that of a society at large to that of the local community and family. Rituals are typically part of the larger category of custom. But ritual practices tend to follow a rigid sequence in the interest of ensuring that the action is correct. For example, it is customary in certain cultures for participants in a wedding to wear certain kinds of clothes. But wedding rituals mandate specific actions in a set order. Even when the principal participants opt for non-customary fashions.
Is there a Confucian or CIT creed?
Neither Confucianism as such nor CIT have ever formulated a specific creedal statement to which all members are expected to confess their allegiance. If asked to summarize his or her religious beliefs, a devout and well-informed Chinese man or woman of a century or two ago would likely have included a number of basic elements relating to Confucianism and CIT. Divine heaven rules all things through a mandate made known to a son of heaven called the emperor. The emperor in turn governs all earthly affairs by enacting that mandate, whose hallmark is justice and equity. It is the emperor's duty to make timely and appropriate offerings to heaven and earth, to ensure the felicitous coordination of all cosmic events for the benefit of humankind. Confucius, as one of the sages, represents a revered tradition of practical wisdom to which a sincere emperor subscribes. All good subjects, too, will acknowledge the sage and those of his stature and will venerate them along with their own ancestors. All of this, they might add, fits into the larger picture of the ultimate harmony represented by the balance of all things under the power of the Dao, which is manifest in heaven and earth.
How do trials or ordeals function in Shinto ritual?
Remnants of ancient practices reminiscent of trial by fire survive in several Shinto ceremonies, most of which are still practiced, in relatively few locations. Unique to the Suwa Shrine in Nagasaki is a frightening ritual called Yoteitsai. At the end of the purification and exorcism rituals, the chief priest of the shrine thrusts his hand into a kettle of boiling water. This rite dates back to the Shug-Endo sect of late medieval times. Now it represents not the ascetic or magical power of ancient practitioners, or the power to banish spirits possessing an unfortunate soul, but the need for radical purification. Some sects use a variation on this ritual, with a priest scattering scalding water on the main participant with a bamboo stick. A related ritual of trial involves walking over burning coals, called Shinkashiki, taming the fire. The ceremony involves circumambulating the bed of embers before walking across it. Anyone present may participate after the principal ritualists complete the ordeal. Again, the purpose is purification, and prayers may include petitioning the kami of the moon to exert his influence on the fire kami.
Do Muslims practice polygamy?
Long before the beginnings of Islam, plural marriage was a fairly common practice. A number of the biblical patriarchs and kings had several wives. Wealthier men of the pre-Islamic Arab tribes apparently engaged in polygamy, marrying as many wives as their wealth would allow. A major concern seems to have been that, in the inhospitable environs of that desert world, women not attached to families had little hope of survival. As cities like Mecca developed, the practice survived in somewhat modified form. But according to a text of the Quran, polygamy in the early Muslim community was to be limited. A man could marry up to 4 women, provided he could treat all of his wives with complete equity both materially and emotionally. In modern times, a number of national governments in the Middle East have outlawed the practice, arguing that modern social and economic conditions have made perfectly fair treatment all but impossible. Even where local laws allow polygamy, relatively few men marry more than 1 woman. And those who marry 4 are a very small minority.
Where and how do religious traditions employ signs and symbols?
Everything from buildings to sacred books to substances like oil and incense play important roles in the everyday lives of religious practitioners. Primary ritual spaces are naturally the most prominent venues for the use of signs and symbols. Temples, synagogues, mosques, and shrines are often visual galleries, filled with sensory input composed entirely of signs and symbols. Architectural style and structure incorporate forms characteristic of each tradition, including towers of various kinds, domes, courtyards, rooms for special functions, and gathering spaces designed to accommodate certain activities and groups of a certain size. Everything about a well-executed ritual space expresses the tradition's beliefs. In their homes, too, religious persons often use signs and symbols to remind themselves of their central spiritual values. Some go so far as to set up elaborate household shrines or altars at which to conduct their private devotions. In certain societies, one can still readily identify members of some religious traditions by the signs and symbols they wear. For the majority of people who so identify themselves, signs and symbols of faith are at least as much a reminder to themselves of their faith commitment as they are a signal to others that they hold certain things sacred.
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise for Hindus?
In India, with its vast Hindu majority, it is still largely taken for granted that young people will marry members of their own denomination or sect as well as of their own caste. Outside India, various external cultural pressures are changing such assumptions. Since Hindu tradition remains so intimately bound to cultural background, many traditional Hindu families would naturally prefer that their children marry other Hindus. By and large, the younger generation continues to do so.
What place does Muhammad occupy in Islamic tradition?
Muslims consider Muhammad the last in a line of prophets, commissioned to act as God's spokesman to humankind. Beginning with Adam and continuing down through Jesus. The pre-Islamic prophets preached the same fundamental message of belief in one sovereign transcendent God. But because successive generations invariably found the message difficult and inconvenient, people sometimes corrupted or diluted the revelation. Hence, God chose upright individuals to reassert the original revelation.
Who are the black Muslims in the Nation of Islam?
In 1930s Detroit, W. D. Fard began teaching that the ancestors of black Americans had been Muslims. Young Elijah Poole became a devoted follower, and Fard declared Poole his successor and prophet. Elijah took the last name Muhammad and continued to develop a community called the Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslims. Two prominent young followers of Elijah Muhammad were Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan. Malcolm X tells in his autobiography how he discovered during his pilgrimage to Mecca that Elijah Muhammad's teachings of a kind of reverse racism were a lie. All human beings were brothers and sisters under God. And Malcolm returned to try to counter-teach Muhammad's misinterpretations of Islam. Malcolm was assassinated in 1965, but 10 years later, when Muhammad died, Elijah's son Wallace took over and continued to pursue the reform movement Malcolm X had begun. Wallace sought to bring the Nation of Islam, newly named the World Community of Islam in the West, in line with mainstream Muslim teachings. Louis Farrakhan, on the other hand, chose to continue the separatist doctrines of Elijah Muhammad and, with his approximately 50,000 followers, retain the name Nation of Islam.
What is a Swami? Is that anything like a Maharishi?
The term Swami comes from the Sanskrit Swami, meaning owner, master. It was originally applied mostly to monastic sannyasis as an acknowledgement of their self-mastery. More recently the term has become a widely used title of reverence for a broader spectrum of religious scholars, teachers, and renunciants. One often hears Hindu religious leaders referred to as Swamiji, a term of both respect and affection. The term Maharishi, literally great seer, is also an honorific title with roots deep in Hindu mythology. Great seers are individuals celebrated for their profound wisdom, Popular tradition designated as great a number of the ancient seers associated with the communication of primal religious insights. But several historical persons have likewise merited the title. Ramana Maharishi, 1879–1950, attracted a great following in the south of India. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, BC 1911. Founder of the School of Transcendental Meditation. Gained fame initially as the teacher of the Beatles in Indian spirituality.
What are parent and established and universal religious communities?
From the distant perspective of at least several centuries we can look back into history in search of the origins of major religious traditions. Though we will never be entirely sure in some cases when a given tradition actually began, or when it became distinct enough from its religious surroundings to be identifiable as a separate entity, we can develop some useful general notions. But it helps to keep in mind that most of our judgments in this regard are quite relative.
How do Muslims interpret their sacred texts?
Discussion of the Quran is a regular activity in most mosques, usually in connection with the Friday congregational prayer, and in the United States also held on Sundays. One or more discussion leaders might present a text and then open the floor to comments and questions. The first concern is generally to establish the circumstances of the revelation.
What is a religious tradition?
Religious tradition, as the term will be used throughout this book, refers to the various systems of belief and values around which communities of religious believers have formed throughout history and across the globe. Most readers are generally familiar with the names of many major religious traditions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and Shinto, to list only the largest. It's tempting to imagine that the members of each of those traditions believe nearly the same things, but that is so only in a very general way. Each of those super traditions in turn is really a cluster or family of traditions. There are many different flavors or styles within each, from the dozens of Christian churches to Islam's Sunni and Shi'i branches, to Buddhism's Theravada and Mahayana subcommunities. It would require a whole library of books to describe in detail the similarities and differences between the various communities of faith represented by the major traditions. This survey will hit the high points, but it will be helpful to keep in mind that it barely scratches the surface of an immensely complex reality. We will look only at some of the traditions that have left written records. And for practical reasons we cannot include the many traditions, such as the Native American, that have preserved their heritages orally.
What attitudes toward pilgrimage are important in Confucianism and CIT?
Confucian teaching generally did not promote the popular practice of pilgrimage. Associated as it was with Daoism and Buddhism. A larger concern had to do with the social and political implications of devotional travel. Many Confucians considered pilgrimage a potential threat to the stability of society. Anthropologists talk about the experience of liminality as an essential part of pilgrimage. Pilgrims step out of their accustomed social roles, leaving behind the rules, duties, and responsibilities of ordinary daily life. They become liminal in that they step across a threshold, limen in Latin, into another way of being and thinking, if only temporarily. For people who regard their function as maintaining social order, the prospect of throngs of pilgrims heading out across the countryside in hope of miracles or magic naturally poses a threat. Enthusiastic crowds are prey to demagogues and can turn into unruly mobs. Still, a parallel to devotional pilgrimage developed among Confucians on a smaller scale. Confucius himself became a model of the itinerant scholar, traveling from one province to another in search of disciples and patrons. Later Confucians often followed his example. Eventually the places in which these Confucian exemplars had lived and taught began to attract visitors. Not surprisingly, the tomb of Confucius in Shandong became a goal for Confucian pilgrims, who were generally in search not of miracles, but of inspiration in the struggle to live a good life. In general, it appears that the tradition of family members caring for ancestral graves may have been significant in preventing burial places from becoming pilgrimage goals. Mountains were also important destinations for China's literati. There, one could contemplate most abundantly nature's sacred beauty. There, too, was the incomparable source of poetic inspiration.
What do Christians believe about God?
God is first of all creator and sustainer of all that is. Lord of time as well as eternity, this supreme being is ceaselessly active in human history, beginning with the divine labor of fashioning the universe. God has provided ongoing guidance and deliverance for all who believe in providence. Christians, like so many other religious people across the globe, sometimes have difficulty reconciling their belief in a God who is good and just with the undeniable evidence of cosmic evil and injustice. In general, Christians believe that God creates all possibilities, good and evil alike, but allows, rather than actively causes, evil actions. At the center of Christian theology is the doctrine of the Incarnation, according to which God the Son, Jesus Christ, came into the world, fully immersed in suffering and evil, in order to redeem humankind from sin by dying on the cross and rising from the dead. In the most vexing kind of paradox, the God-made man Jesus Christ suffers and dies for human beings, who are in turn his murderers. According to Christian belief, God is triune, three equal persons in one deity Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the Son is at once wholly human and wholly divine. The Holy Trinity represents perfect transcendence and perfect immanence. In other words, God is both infinitely beyond the realm of human experience and immediately accessible to all who seek divine aid.
What is a miracle?
A miracle is broadly defined as an apparent breach in the laws of nature that so defies rational explanation as to suggest the possibility of divine intervention. Miracles or the working of wonders figure prominently in the sacred texts and lore of most major religious traditions. But they do not necessarily serve the same purpose from one tradition to another. In some cases, miracles are believed to provide incontrovertible proof of the truth of a particular revelation by establishing beyond doubt the power of the agent. Miracles are not just a fancy extra tossed in to entertain the masses, but an integral part of some systems of belief. Sometimes miracles occur in the context of a controversy by way of a dramatic settlement in favor of the miracle worker. One characteristic of miracles that does appear to be a feature in many traditions is that those who choose obstinately not to believe do not necessarily change their minds in the presence of a miracle. In fact, they simply do not see what the believers standing next to them see. That seems to suggest that, in some traditions at least, wonders are in the eye of the beholder, so that a witness must be predisposed to see a miracle. Some traditions regard miracles as a gift from a divine source to certain special persons, whether prophets or saints, designed to establish their spiritual credentials. A miracle can revolve around some symbolic action that, even apart from the apparently miraculous result, contains the central message.
What's the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews?
Prior to 1492 there were large Jewish communities on the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain, and Portugal. During the final phases of the Catholic reconquest of Spain, Jews were given the option of converting or going into exile. Many of those who chose to leave migrated all over the Mediterranean basin, including North Africa and the Middle East, to found new communities. These descendants of Iberian Jewry are called Sephardic Jews. They comprise a small minority, perhaps 20% or less, of the global Jewish population. Sephardic Jews retain a number of distinctive ritual and legal interpretations, and in some places manage to preserve the Ladino language of their ancestral Iberia and maintain separate educational institutions. By far the majority of Jews are Ashkenazim. Their name derives from the medieval Hebrew designation of Central Europe as Ashkenaz. Descendants of the early Jewish settlers in Central and Eastern Europe preserve Ashkenazic traditions all over the world. Most Jewish immigrants to the United States have been Ashkenazim. Although the majority of the earliest, in colonial times, were Sephardim. In general, Jews in the Americas have not maintained a serious distinction between Sephardic and Ashkenazic customs and practices. And few synagogues nowadays restrict membership one way or the other.
How did Buddhism become important in China, Korea, and Japan?
Buddhism spread across North and East Asia was an extended and complex process. That was part of the northern transmission begun as early as the reign of Ashoka. Serious missionary efforts commenced in China sometime during the 1st century CE. Within a century or so, a new wave of monk translators from India was engaged in large-scale proselytizing among the Chinese. Buddhism spread rapidly and flourished in the form of several denominations and schools. Some estimate that over half the population had accepted the new tradition by around 450 CE. A major persecution in 845 under a deist emperor did serious damage to all but the Pure Land and Chen, Zen, lineages. A Chinese missionary monk introduced Buddhism to Korea around the late 4th century. By the mid-6th century, Buddhism enjoyed royal patronage and spread throughout the Korean peninsula. In about 552 the Korean monarch sent the Japanese emperor as a gift, an image of the Buddha and some sacred texts. The new faith soon found itself welcome, and adapted rapidly in the land of the rising sun. Monks from China and Korea continued to bring the teachings of various denominations to Japan during the 7th and 8th centuries. Those schools proved attractive to relatively small numbers of people. So during the early 9th century, 3 Japanese monks who had been studying in China brought back simpler teachings with greater popular appeal. Several schools based on Pure Land teaching enjoyed considerable success over the next 300 years. Then a new wave of Buddhist growth and development washed over Japan in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Honen, 1133 to 1212, established the Pure Land School as a distinct denomination. And 2 Japanese monks founded the main branches of Zen Buddhism.
What is the nature of the human person in Shinto tradition?
Shinto tradition has not given great attention to speculation about the metaphysical aspects of the human person. Conceptions of soul or spirit at the core of human nature tend to be rather fluid. Not unlike popular Chinese ideas about these things. Reflecting the various aspects of both human and divine action, soul, or spirit, Tama, can manifest itself as either rich in blessings, granting harmony and union, full of mysterious power, or rough, Individuals take second place to the needs of society as a whole. As a result, traditional Shinto thought does not reflect in depth about the self apart from the collective. Above all, human beings are children of the kami whose natural birthright is to benefit from nature's gifts. Society and family, as well as nature, are the wellsprings of life. Acknowledging and venerating one's ancestors keeps healthy the link between individual and society because it keeps alive the continuity of heritage.
Do Buddhists believe in angels?
Buddhist popular belief inherited and retained many of the different types of celestial and semi-divine beings that populated Hindu myth. Nearly all Hindu deities have their personal attendants. In addition, a variety of other spiritual presences fill the heavenly and earthly realms. Artists often depict these characters as floating gracefully, but they generally lack the wings most people associate with angels. A class of being called apsaras, Sanskrit for moving in water, are the most numerous of these denizens of the intermediate realm. Early Buddhist artists sometimes depicted apsaras as devotees worshipping the Buddha's footprints or gathered around the tree of enlightenment. Another group, called the Gandharvas, were Hindu demigods who entertained the deities as musicians and dancers. Buddhist tradition retained them in that capacity. The classic angelic function of guardianship and protection resides in other classes of beings regarded as gods in some sects. Lokapalas, world guardians, are those who stand watch over the four quarters of the universe. Many Buddhist temples depict them as muscular, heavily armed gatekeepers. The Dharmapalas, guardians of the teaching, are a band of fearsome deities whose task is to guard believers, especially in Vajrayana. As a kind of personal deity assigned to each individual, these protectors can take on either benevolent or angry form, depending on whether they are dealing with a believer or with an enemy of the faith.
What signs or symbols distinguish Confucian and CIT ritual specialists?
Even today, leaders of Confucian rituals are typically also government officials. When they function as ritual specialists, they don the garments once worn by representatives of the imperial household and administration. As for CIT, since there is no longer any official imperial religious worship, there are no longer CIT ritual specialists. Prior to 1911, however, CIT ritualists, from the emperor on down to the humblest assistant, simply wore the garments that signified their respective bureaucratic ranks and offices. In this case, the literati did double duty as custodians of both civil and religious ritual. For especially important events, officials wore various garments known generically as dragon robes. each decorated with emblems of the wearer's administrative rank. Imperial robes worn by the ruler during rituals were once festooned with an array of symbolic decorative motifs known collectively as the 12 ornaments, or symbols. Symbolizing heaven and its wisdom were the sun, shown with a three-legged raven inside its red disk. The blue or green moon surrounding a hair grinding. The elixir of immortality with mortar and pestle, and the constellations. Images of mountains symbolized earth and strength. Standing for all living things, the dragon symbolized resilience. The pheasant, culture and literary accomplishment. In images of bronze ritual vessels, celebrants saw filial devotion. In cereal grains, abundant harvest, in flame illumination, and in the water plant purity. Along with the mountains, the latter four also corresponded with the 5 elements. Finally, the fu, a geometric form meaning good fortune, and the axe referred respectively to the imperial prerogatives of judgment and punishment. When displayed together, the 12 were done in combinations of the 5 symbolic colors associated with the 5 directions. None but the emperor's ritual vestments could depict all 12 ornaments, since they constituted a symbolic summary of the whole cosmos.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a practitioner of Shinto?
Apart from times of participation in public or private rituals, it is virtually impossible to identify practitioners of Shinto on the basis of appearances. When people join in festival processions, many don small jackets called happy that extend to about mid-thigh, and headbands. Happy sometimes bear the logo of the local association that carries the Mikoshi portable shrine in processions. On special days, young women may dress up in their best kimono. Devotees sometimes return home from shrines carrying amulets or talismans, but these items are visible less often on the person than in the home.
How and where do members of local Christian communities come together?
Christians generally gather for worship in buildings called churches, although numerous smaller groups meet in homes or places not set apart exclusively for religious functions. Some Pentecostal and holiness communities called their gathering places temples. Attached to many churches may be a variety of facilities such as schools, kitchens for catering community celebrations, auditoriums, social service offices, pastoral residences, monasteries, and convents, libraries, shelters for the homeless and for battered women, soup kitchens, and cemeteries. In general, the larger the community attached to a particular institutional framework, the greater the diversity of facilities and the broader the social outreach is likely to be.
What is meant by the term Zionism?
In general, Zionism means the modern movement of Jewish return to the Holy Mountain of Zion in the hope of reclaiming it as the heart of the biblical Promised Land. Nathan Birnbaum coined the usage in 1890. In 1896, Theodor Herzl organized the political movement that has borne the name ever since. Herzl convened the first of many Zionist congresses at Basel in 1897. Chaim Weizmann, 1874 to 1952, was one of the most influential leaders of the movement. He was a powerful presence from the negotiation of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, a watershed document that ultimately made serious talk of a Jewish state possible. Right through negotiations for Israeli statehood in 1947. Weizmann also served as Israel's first president. Zionism has, to be sure, been a bone of contention because of the political and social implications of so dramatic a reshaping of what had formerly been called Palestine.